It's time to get political once again, something I rarely do on my channel. But when talking about the 2006 Marvel storyline Civil War, it's kinda impossible not to. The story not only split the Marvel universe right down the center, but it seems to have split the entire comic book community as well in the years since its release. Some people love it, others hate it. The general consensus I find, though, is that its themes were strong, but its execution, how the political ideas were expressed in it, were mishandled. And yeah, I would have to agree for the most part with that sentiment. The story's message does get a bit muddled in areas, and I understand why a lot of people were, and still are, frustrated with it. But at the same time, I think a lot of Civil War is misunderstood. Even though it doesn't hit the nail on the head with all of its ideas throughout, some of them are quite fascinating and provocative regardless. I admire a lot of what was attempted with this story, the good and the bad, because it managed to effectively interweave politics with costumed superheroes in a very realistic way. I'd argue some of the most realistic in the comic book medium, even to this day. I think a few people have argued that the writing in this story, mostly in terms of characterization, is questionable, that some characters feel like they are written out of character at times. But honestly, that's a criticism I have to disagree with, sorta. When you inject this level of realism into a story, have these characters deal with such an extreme political curveball thrown at them like they do, I think having them act differently is entirely appropriate. Many times in real life, you will think you know someone until a heavy political discussion comes up and their true colors will rise to the surface. The question is, would superheroes be any different? I don't think so at all. Civil War pins these seemingly flawless characters against a wall, and the political argument that transpires allows any imperfections within their ideologies to seep out, which I think makes some people uncomfortable, leaves a bit of a bad taste in their mouth. But instead of feeling inconsistent or wrong for these characters, it just makes them feel more layered, interesting, and three-dimensional in my opinion, because this story makes them act like real people, flesh and bone. When it comes to politics, it's almost always messy. There are always two sides to every argument, and nothing ever really happens as smoothly as it should. Emotions can be blinding. A lot of political decisions start out simple with good intentions, but will escalate and become morally corrupt or compromised in some way due to a variety of factors, and the events in Civil War are no different. Something that would start out as a simple question of national security could snowball into an all-out war for individual freedom in a heartbeat. As humans, we fail to understand that you can't always have freedom and security. Sometimes it can only be one or the other. Civil War addresses the idea of superheroes in a very realistic way, shows how they would be treated in the real world if they, in fact, existed. We see how quickly society would turn on them through fear and paranoia, how their governments would vilify them and strip them of their rights, discriminate against them because of their powers. A national tragedy would occur in Stamford, Connecticut. A group of young and naive superheroes called the New Warriors would battle a group of supervillains on national television, hoping to boost the ratings of their own reality TV show. One of the New Warriors, named Namorita, daughter of Namor's cousin Namora, pins one of the villains, Nitro, against a school bus on the street, and he would use his powers to detonate himself, killing over 600 innocent people in the neighborhood, 60 of which were children. The more experienced heroes, the Avengers, would be forced to pick up the pieces, dealing with the immediate aftermath, trying to save as many people trapped in the rubble as possible, and try to make sense of everything that happened. What an image! Iron Man wonders why they weren't the ones called in to deal with the villains, and informs Captain America that Nitro had fled town. News has been circulating that the new Warriors were after ratings. None of it looks good, and the government now has something concrete to blame on superheroes, something he says they have been after for a while. We see Wolverine on edge when Sentinels arrive to help out the injured civilians, as a nearby mother tells her child that they are there to keep an eye on the X-Men, to keep them safe from them. They're the good guys. Ouch. Superheroes and the role they play within society becomes the talk of the entire nation. Debates over their responsibility, accountability, and whether or not their unique powers and or skills, regardless of whether or not they are used as detriments against criminals and criminal activity, should be viewed as dangerous weapons, liabilities that need to be controlled or eliminated altogether. Hate crimes against superheroes begin popping up all over the place, with one particular attack involving Johnny Storm, the Human Torch, outside of a nightclub. He is called a kid killer and a terrorist, is struck from behind and brutally beaten by several patrons while unconscious. Gutless cowards. All of this civil unrest in the country leads to a legislative bill being passed by the U.S. government called the Superhuman Registration Act. Its purpose is to protect the American populace and regulate the behavior of superpowered individuals. In order for a superhuman to continue to be a costumed hero, they would need to register their secret identities and addresses with the U.S. government. They would be trained and monitored like other forms of public servants, like police, firefighters, or paramedics, for example. Opposing this law and continuing to act as a superhero outside of the government's jurisdiction would result in arrest, prosecution, and imprisonment. Anyone discovered to be sheltering an illegal superhero and hiding their identity will be considered an accomplice to their crimes and will be charged with aiding and abetting a criminal. In a nutshell, the entire U.S. becomes a police state, with S.H.I.E.L.D. agents and registered superheroes hunting down the ones who have not registered or refuse to register. Despite its polarized reception, Civil War was a financial success for Marvel Comics. Its tagline was "Whose side are you on?", having its readers choose a side, take a stance. In the story, the superheroes of the Marvel Universe would become divided, with those that supported the Registration Act standing behind Tony Stark, Iron Man, and those that were against it, part of Steve Rogers, Captain America's Resistance Force. I know some people have taken issue with the fact that both sides of this debate, both political stances, aren't given equal footing in this story, as one appears to be glorified and the other vilified throughout. But like all war, desperate times can call for desperate measures. Things can get messy, problems escalate, and in the end, oftentimes, all the fighting does more harm than good to both sides. Casualties are casualties, all the same. How both these main players react to the conflict as it rages on is very accurate to their personalities and histories when you really think about it. Rogers has always been very old school with his approach, sometimes overly optimistic and simplistic. His strong convictions are admirable, his greatest strength, but they may get in the way of the bigger picture at hand. With Stark, he's a futurist, taking every possibility into account before making a decision, and naturally, he's always been someone in control, the boss, and when times get tough, will grow desperate and overstep his boundaries. With his past issues and failures, he also takes every defeat, every mistake that happens, personal, and tries to make things right or reduce the chance of things getting worse to the best of his ability. If you just read the primary 7 Civil War issues of this storyline, then I guarantee the political message you get from it will be tainted. Both sides will not have been given a fighting chance in your mind, and it will appear far more black and white as to who the good guys and bad guys are. But Civil War was a massive event spanning multiple titles, and if you ever want to read it from start to finish, I suggest sticking with the comics centering around Captain America, Iron Man, and Spider-Man on top of the main Civil War ones to get the most focused and balanced narrative out of it as possible. You don't want to read too many of the issues that the message of the storyline gets lost in the shuffle, but at the same time, you don't want to read too little and just scratch the surface with a lot of these political ideas. The most important reading material of Civil War, though, in my opinion, is the 11-issue Frontline series written by Paul Jenkins that takes place concurrently with the main storyline and is the glue that holds everything together. It shows a more unbiased perspective of the war from the viewpoint of two reporters, Ben Urich, who works at the Daily Bugle, and Sally Floyd, who works at a smaller newspaper called The Alternative, who investigate various stories on both the pro-registration and anti-registration sides. Like I said, it's the glue that holds the entire Civil War story together. It takes on a more grounded perspective, paints a stronger, more unbiased picture of what's going on. One of the stories in Frontline is called The Accused, and it's my favorite of the series, probably my favorite in all of Civil War. It centers around the lone survivor of the Stamford tragedy, one of the new warriors named Robbie Baldwin, the superhero known as Speedball. Speedball's body has the power to absorb kinetic energy and create a force field of bubbles around it, which can then be reflected. This allowed him to survive the explosion in Connecticut, as his body was launched hundreds of miles away by the recoil. He would be found in a field by a farmer and a police officer, but tragically, those two men would die as well when Robbie's body discharged even more leftover energy from Nitro's blast. When Robbie wakes up in a hospital room, he doesn't even have time to collect his bearings before countless murder charges are laid on him, and he is placed under arrest by S.H.I.E.L.D. Though he is offered a chance to register under the newly passed bill, it doesn't really matter, as his secret identity had already been revealed to the government and public at large while he was in a coma. Robbie becomes the poster boy for the Registration Act and a lightning rod for all of America's hatred and disgust towards superheroes. He becomes the most hated man in the country. Robbie refuses to register because that would be an admission of guilt, and he doesn't believe himself to be guilty. It wasn't his fault all those people died in Stamford, it was Nitro's. As a result, Robbie is sent to a new maximum security prison for non-registered superhumans, called the Number 42 Complex, built in the negative zone. This is another one of the more controversial elements of the Civil War storyline. How could the pro-registration heroes be the good guys if they are imprisoning former superheroes, former friends, in such a nightmarish and foreboding-looking prison such as this? The fact that it's built in the negative zone is shady enough, but getting in requires a scan of one's handprint, fingerprint, bone configuration, blood type, and DNA, which seems a bit excessive. Door passwords change every 10 minutes. The walls are made of synthetic vibranium, and each cell is designed to counter the powers of the prisoner being held in it, which makes escape virtually impossible. I don't think they even use this level of security with the prisons the supervillains are in. Damn. To the credit of the pro-reg side, the complex is at least clean, state-of-the-art. Some prisoners are treated quite well, bordering on luxury, and the principle behind it does make logical sense. Superhumans would need to be contained in a stronger type of prison than the one your average run-of-the-mill human being would be kept in. Escape would have to be prevented to ensure the safety of the world from their potentially dangerous superpowers, their weapons, in all their different forms, if they refuse to have them regulated. But saying this kind of stuff is a lot easier when you are dissecting fiction, isn't it? Because the fact of the matter is, like some other notable events throughout history, these people have been stripped of their rights, their humanity, are being judged and discriminated against based on who and what they are and not on their actions, are guilty until proven innocent and not the other way around, and that is just monstrous. Anywho, going back to Robbie Baldwin for a second, his time in this concentration camp-like prison changes him, slowly burning a hole into his soul. When given the opportunity to plead his case to the Senate, he is confronted by an angry mob and shot by the father of one of the children killed in Connecticut, an image that mirrors the murder of Lee Harvey Oswald, the U.S. Marine who assassinated John F. Kennedy in 1963. This attack leaves Robbie in critical condition. As his life fades, and scared that he is going to die, he thinks about all of his regrets in life he's had, and on the precipice of his demise, he finally accepts his role in the death of his friends, the New Warriors, as well as the 600 other people in Stamford. Robbie blames himself and his powers for what happened, which at that point had all but burnt out following Nitro's explosion. However, on his way to the hospital, Robbie's powers resurface again, and a burst of electricity totals the ambulance and kills the paramedics who were treating him. His government-appointed lawyer, She-Hulk, of course survives. Pro-registration hero Reed Richards would perform tests on Robbie's body and determines that the bullet fragments lodged in his spinal cord have begun mutating his abilities due to the extreme stimulation they have caused on his body. His powers have evolved and seem to be siphoning bioelectrical energy from the environment around him, feeding it to his nervous system to keep him alive. Pain is what keeps him alive. It fuels his powers at this point. When Robbie comes to, he has a change of heart and decides to finally register with the government and become a hero once again, but he burns his Speedball costume with gasoline and has a new one made for himself, a reinforced alloy armor with over 600 carbonate steel spikes lining the inside of it. As he wears the suit, the spikes will pierce his skin, causing him immense pain, and charge up his powers using energy conduits built inside them. Each spike represents a victim in Stamford, with the largest ones, 60 in total, representing the children. The biggest spike of all is for Sarah Stricker, the daughter of the man who shot him, and her spike is right near his heart. The concept behind all of this is pretty gruesome for Marvel. As Robbie is getting suited up, you can see the blood trickling down his arms, how much agonizing pain he is in, and the damage wearing this suit is doing to his body the second he puts it on. But I like the symbolic meaning it all has. He's a tortured soul filled with survivor's guilt. To him, Robbie Baldwin is dead. Speedball is dead. Only Penance remains, which is the new name he takes on as a hero. As cool of a character as he is, though, I don't think Penance really works all that well outside the confines of this story. He needs all the political stuff to be effective, the context behind the pain to thrive. But let's return to the meat and potatoes of this Civil War conflict between Captain America and Iron Man. In Iron Man's defense, he tried to prevent the Registration Act from happening the best he could. The seeds for it had been planted long before, though. In the one-shot issue, New Avengers Illuminati, which acts as a prologue to the Civil War storyline, Tony had met with Professor X, Doctor Strange, Mr. Fantastic, Black Panther, Namor, and Black Bolt decades prior, following the Kree-Skrull War, and suggested that all of Earth's heroes unify themselves, building one giant superhero governing body to protect the planet instead of the countless smaller teams they had going, each with their own agendas. His idea was quickly shot down by the others, who believed the unified group would be far too powerful to control, and all of the politics would get in the way of their jobs as superheroes. But they do agree to keep things small, forming a secret society known as the Illuminati, in order to exchange information and influence world events as much as they can to keep the Earth safe. Years later, shortly before the Registration Act came into existence, Tony called one final meeting of the Illuminati to warn them about it. He believed if the act were passed, all heroes would have to reveal their secret identities to the government and be monitored like other public servants. Using his incredible foresight, he also believed all it would take for the bill to go into effect was a mistake by a young, foolhardy hero or group of heroes, and there would be no turning back from it, foreshadowing what was to come. Despite Tony's warnings, they mostly go unheard, and the Illuminati would officially disband. Tony would go to Washington and speak in a closed hearing to fight back against the proposed Superhuman Registration Act. Tagging along with him is Peter Parker, who he had recently offered a job as his protege, even buttering him up with an advanced Spidey suit he designed which had increased gliding capabilities, ultraviolet and infrared scanners, could camouflage itself with its surroundings, was bulletproof, and had 4 retractable mechanical arms that could grab things, strike, and had cameras built into them for surveillance purposes. At the hearing, a senator named Whitmore explains that an estimated $200 billion in damages have occurred since the Second World War, when the existence of superpowered beings became prominent in the country. $200 billion that the taxpayers have been forced to pay. Tony responds by saying in that same span of time, superheroes have saved North America alone from catastrophic destruction 47 times, and that the Department of Defense's budget for that year alone was over $400 billion. Peter also brings up the doctrine of proportionate response, which is essentially self-defense. The legality of an action is determined by how proportionate it is to the aggressive force. The balance of the objective is based on the methods of the action and all of its possible consequences. He also mentions something that is brought up countless times throughout the storyline, the fact that heroes need to keep their identities a secret to protect the lives of their loved ones from any threats that pop up. They never asked for their powers, but with them, all they are trying to do is help. The senator argues that police officers, prosecutors, judges, and elected officials all face those same risks every day. Why should superheroes be treated differently? Tony believes that changing the superhero system they have had in place for the last 60 years will result in a strong divide within the country. Heroes would be turned into villains overnight, and it could lead to war. Regardless of what Tony and Peter say, though, you get a sense that the senators had already made up their minds going into the meeting. It was a kangaroo court the whole time. After day 1 of the hearing, while Tony and Peter leave the Senate building, Titanium Man attacks and tries to assassinate Stark. Peter intervenes and battles the Russian-born villain, but the media believe Titanium Man and Spider-Man are somehow in cahoots with each other and putting the lives of everyone there at risk. As Spider-Man is pinned against a wall, his suit's cameras record the villain saying his employer wanted Stark dead to ensure the Registration Act was passed. Superheroes would be vilified, and the government would be so preoccupied tracking the outliers down that it would leave the rest of the country defenseless from outside threats like him. Titanium Man would flee the scene, and the following morning the hearing would continue. Tony provides video evidence of Titanium Man's conversation with Spider-Man, but the senators dismiss it, believing it to be fraudulent and unauthentic, of course. Peter would disrupt the hearing in costume as Spider-Man and explain that superheroes should always be allowed to act whenever they themselves deem it necessary. If they are ordered around by someone else, it may compromise what it means to be a hero, who they view to be the bad guys. But when Spider-Man refuses to remove his mask and reveal his name and address to the committee, they throw all his points out from the record, not considering him to be a citizen, but a faceless human being. One of the senators, Senator Dickinson, makes a really good point at the end of the hearing, though, that no one is above the law. That's a superpower no one in his country should have. Too bad that couldn't be farther from the truth, especially with politicians. Am I right? Anywho, not only did the hearing feel like a mock trial on the part of the senators, who already seemed to have their minds made up even before it started, but we have reason to believe Tony's mind was made up as well. He had already chosen a side and was pretending to defend the other. When walking past the Lincoln Memorial, Tony says Lincoln's actions caused a civil war with the South, but that his actions were necessary to restore and save the nation in the end. We come to realize that Tony Stark, ever the futurist, always several steps ahead, was the one to employ Titanium Man and have him attack the Senate building. He wanted the Registration Act to not only be high on the government's list of options, but the only option. He's had a long-term plan to save the United States and its superheroes for quite some time. In the hours leading up to the registration bill being passed, all of the Marvel heroes gather in the Baxter Building. Speculation over what will happen runs rampant, and they are already seeing a divide amongst themselves. They argue over whether or not they should be able to hide behind masks. Wolverine says they should because the world is an unforgiving place outside of the fancy ivory towers, like the one they currently find themselves in. The Fantastic Four firmly believe in going public with their identities. They find it to be reasonable and haven't had any problems personally. Their real names have been known by everyone for years. Spider-Man disagrees, though. He doesn't have endless resources he or his loved ones can hide behind like the Fantastic Four do if things go sour. On the SHIELD helicarrier hovering above New York, Commander Maria Hill meets with Captain America to address the big elephant, or I guess elephants, in the room, whether or not his friends down there in the Baxter Building are going to cooperate and register. Steve Rogers can't speak for any of them, but knows the act is going to lead to war, splitting them right down the center. Seeing as he is an agent of the government, Hill suggests that Cap go down there and convince any of the naysayers if he has to. She orders him to, like he's a mindless attack dog. Cap refuses to arrest people that have risked their lives to save his country numerous times, and it's here where we get a firm understanding of Cap's stance on the entire Registration Act. Though his secret identity is public knowledge, the act infringes on individual rights, individual privacy. He may love his country, but he doesn't love the politicians running it. Politics and superheroes should remain separate. The government doesn't tell him who the bad guys are and never will. He alone does. He also believes how SHIELD will enforce the act will only lead to more violence, putting the lives of heroes and innocent people at risk. And this is something we see more and more as the story goes on. Some of these government agents are just warmongers hiding behind a badge. They love having an excuse to be aggressive and cause senseless collateral damage. They're the real criminals in all of this. So yeah, Cap refuses to follow his orders, and Hill commands her men to arrest him like they would any other masked supervillain for breaking the law. Rogers warns the agents to stand down, but of course they don't, and he's forced to carve into them with his shield and tenderize their ribs and faces with a helping of knuckle sandwiches. He ends up crashing through the helicarrier's window, lands on a nearby fighter jet, and threatens the pilot to ensure that he is safely returned to the ground. In the Baxter Building, the heroes are amazed at the sight of the Watcher, who only appears like this to document moments of significant change in the universe, which can't be a good sign. In Washington, Iron Man, Mr. Fantastic, and Hank Pym, Yellow Jacket, meet with the president and offer to bring in Captain America, who will surely go underground and become a dangerous figurehead of the non-registered superhumans moving forward. The Superhuman Registration Act is officially passed by the U.S. Congress. Many heroes register their identities with the government. Some quit being heroes altogether, unable to afford it in more ways than one, and others join up with Captain America and his resistance, fighting crime on the other side of the law, with the media referring to them as Secret Avengers, before the Secret Avengers were made into an actual thing. The registered heroes continue to go about their business, save lives, and become cheered by the masses, believing faith in superheroes is slowly returning again. Several pro-registration political ads are filmed. One shows registered heroes saving a school bus full of children from a monstrous robot, with a narration provided by Iron Man that heroes need training, guidance, and oversight, and that good intentions alone mean nothing. He believes rigorous training would prevent something like Stanford from ever happening again, and promises it never will. It's an empty promise, though. Evil will always exist. Criminals, villains, mistakes are bound to happen. Superheroes, after all, are still human, no matter how much you try to sugarcoat it. Another one of the pro-registration propaganda commercials features Wonder Man. It shows how excruciatingly complicated stopping a simple bank robbery is now, with the police officers that arrive asking him for his registration card, him providing a thorough explanation of the events that transpired with specific timestamps, how long he will be in the area, and being informed when he will be due in court to explain everything to a judge. But of course, it's all presented in a way that makes it look easy. I'm sure the actual sequence of events will play out just as smoothly as it does here, and the police will always be this understanding and cooperative, right? Give you enough time to provide all this info before emptying a magazine into you, just like in real life. Going into a few specific heroes and their reactions to registration, it seems like Doctor Strange could get rid of a lot of these issues with his magic, but he instead takes a more peaceful approach, leaves for the Arctic to meditate and fast until the conflict is over. He doesn't want to take a stance because he believes neither side is right or wrong. It's only a matter of perspective, though he does hope for an outcome that will benefit all of humanity and result in as little bloodshed as possible. The X-Men, most of them at least, have taken a neutral stance regarding the Registration Act and don't want to get involved, already knowing better than anyone what it's like to be hunted down and persecuted. Tony Stark would meet with Emma Frost, the head mistress of Xavier's X-Mansion, following the events of M-Day, and would agree to allow the mutants exemption from the act so long as they stay on the school's grounds. They are essentially held prisoner there by sentinels that patrol the outer walls, and are programmed to capture any mutant that leaves without proper authorization. Yay, freedom! Spider-Man is put in a very difficult situation throughout this story, probably the most difficult out of anyone. He believes he has a responsibility to do the right thing, and that superheroes need to take ownership over their actions. That's what his character has been about since the very beginning, yet at the same time wants to keep his loved ones safe, and is reluctant to reveal his secret identity to the government because their databases could easily become compromised by tech-savvy supervillains and the information shared with the world. He had agreed to stand behind Iron Man whatever the cost as his protege, but at times Peter was clearly manipulated by Stark, groomed into believing his side of the argument. Eventually, Pete's given an ultimatum that he either registers and reveals his identity to the government, or Tony will terminate his employment. He's blackmailed, but Tony is standing behind the Registration Act, so how else was this gonna go? At a press conference, Tony complicates things by showing off numerous forms of his armor he has built over the years, and explains that Iron Man has always struggled with his personal identity. Though the Registration Act does not require heroes to reveal their civilian identities to the public at large, Stark refuses to be called a hypocrite, dishonest, or cowardly, and unmasks in front of them anyways. This troubles Peter, because he comes to the terrifying realization that if he doesn't go public himself, Tony could just forcefully out him against his will anyways. After a serious conversation with his Aunt May and his wife MJ, who reinforce how proud they are of him being Spider-Man, want him to share that pride with the rest of the world, stand his ground, and make them all understand why he's loved, he finds the strength to no longer hide, feel any shame, and comes out to everyone on national TV. Peter's feelings of being stuck, trapped, and even manipulated in this story can be applied to a lot of difficult real-life situations: blackmailing, gaslighting, and the more obvious, coming out with one's sexuality or gender identity. Reporters in the comic label Spider-Man's unmasking as him coming out of the closet, a reference to the fact that he had been secretly wearing colorful long underwear for a living, but the symbolism to other forms of coming out is quite evident. Peter's unmasking leads to a few immediate consequences in his life. His boss, J. Jonah Jameson, feels betrayed over the information, like he and his newspaper were made a mockery of for years. Peter is fired from the Daily Bugle, and Jameson goes so far as suing him for $5 million for misrepresentation, fraud, breach of contract, the works. And just like Peter had predicted, several of his villains begin plotting ways to attack him and his allies when they least expect it. At a press conference, Iron Man threatens to reveal the identities of over 100 heroes if they do not register by the deadline the following day at midnight. Spider-Man is also listed among names, part of Iron Man's strike force to hunt down and capture any superhuman who doesn't register. This angers Peter because he wasn't told about any of it beforehand. The first true conflict of the Marvel Civil War would occur at midnight on deadline day. The anti-registration hero Prodigy would be seen drinking his sorrows away on a rooftop near City Hall. He's confronted by Iron Man and a bunch of S.H.I.E.L.D. helicopters. Prodigy calls Tony a traitor, that he and the government have torn this country's superheroes apart, and that Tony will just hide in his mansion like a coward while everyone else, less fortunate, will have their livelihoods torn to shreds. Ben Urich, Sally Floyd, and many other civilians watch in horror as their heroes begin fighting one another in the rain. Battle lines have officially been drawn, and shortly after, fighting between pro-Reg and anti-Reg forces start happening across the nation. Captain America, Daredevil, Goliath, and Hercules meet in a diner, having taken on completely new secret identities to blend in with the crowd and perform heroic duties when needed. Just like the anti-registration heroes had been given the nickname of Kid Killers by the opposite side, the pro-registration heroes are being called Cape Killers by the Resistance and its supporters. The anti-Reg heroes learn of people trapped in a chemical plant and change into their costumes in a nearby alley to go and save them. When Captain America and his resistance arrive, being teleported there by Cloak, Cable realizes that the plant is owned by Stark Industries. It's a trap, and Cloak, as well as the group's other means of fast escape, the mutant mage Wiccan, are taken out by tranquilizing sniper shots. The Resistance are then surrounded by Iron Man, his strike team, and more S.H.I.E.L.D. helicopters. Hulkling is also seen checking on his man. Tony offers Steve amnesty, but Cap refuses to surrender. Spider-Man butts in and says what Captain America is doing goes against every principle he has ever believed in, which Steve thinks Peter has no right to bring up, seeing as he threw his principles away when he unmasked himself on live TV. Tony offers Steve his hand, and surprisingly, Cap takes it, but really, Cap just used it as an opportunity to place an electron scrambler onto Tony's suit, temporarily deactivating it. All the heroes begin fighting each other, and their egos and personal vendettas get the better of them, clouding their judgment. Spider-Man takes a cheap shot at Captain America, and when Tony's Iron Man armor recovers, he uses it to predict and counter all of Cap's fighting maneuvers, to unleash a flurry of blows that tear open the face of Rogers' costume. Iron Man would then scramble the brains of Rogers and his troops with an extremely high frequency emitting from his suit, though it is quickly shut off when Hercules, unaffected by it, throws a train car at Tony. Eventually, Maria Hill and S.H.I.E.L.D. call in their big guns, codename Lightning, some psychological warfare in the form of the mighty Thor, believed to have been dead by his fellow heroes and friends. In actuality, Thor was just missing in action due to Ragnarok. Slumbering would be a more accurate description. This Thor that pops up during Civil War is a fake, a cyborg clone of him made by Reed Richards, Hank Pym, and Stark Industries, using a strand of the real Thor's hair. However, like the old saying goes, it's all fun and games until someone gets hurt. The cyborg Thor would end up killing Goliath with a bolt of lightning that pierces his chest cavity, though some of the comics later in this story also depict it as a lightning storm to the face. Either way, the fucker's dead. Susan Storm turns on her husband Reed, unlike the others, not being fooled by his unethical lab experiment, and helps the Resistance heroes escape, with Cable accessing Cloak's mind and activating a teleport. Ben Urich had witnessed the carnage at the chemical factory, and following the battle, he interviews Iron Man over what had happened, why Thor had been brought in, and why all of a sudden the God of Thunder is willing to end a life. Tony says he can't go into detail due to concerns over national security, but that he feels bad. Thor will be exonerated for his actions, and that in war, casualties are bound to happen. They come with the territory. Urich prods further regarding the recent decision by Stark and S.H.I.E.L.D. to enlist supervillains to their cause, and Iron Man refuses to comment. Due to his desperate need to maintain control of the situation, Tony and the government would implement reinforcements in the form of nanite-controlled villains called the Thunderbolts. Their mission was to find and capture unregistered superheroes. Sounds like an incredibly dumb and risky idea. Both sides return to their bases to heal from their injuries. Members on each team begin second-guessing their choices, and some are so overwhelmed by the war that they give it up entirely and go into hiding. I don't blame them. Peter is regretting his decision to join up with Iron Man, not liking the orders he's being given. He also has reason to believe that his new suit has been scanning his body for readings and feeding the information to Tony. He knows about his spider sense, which is something he's only ever told MJ and Aunt May about. While escorting a convoy of imprisoned unregistered superheroes, Spider-Man comes face to face with Captain America. The two come to blows, and Peter finds himself struggling to keep up with Cap's superior fighting skills, even with his spider sense. He is taken aback by Cap's shield when it's thrown at him, as if the entire country it represents is behind it. Spidey's mechanical arms give him a bit of an advantage. He draws first blood with one of them, cutting Captain America's cheek. All this does is piss him off. The fight ends in a stalemate. Rogers departs to help his allies when he hears a large explosion, just when things were starting to get interesting. Peter would go and meet with Tony and Reed to discuss the negative zone prison, something else that is giving him second thoughts. Some people may throw shade on Mr. Fantastic in this story, think he's being an unjustified dickhead, but science and experimentation has always mattered more to him than anything else in his life, even his relationships oftentimes, unfortunately. Much like Tony, he is a realist coming to conclusions using fact and rationale. He knows that without law, human beings would be savages. They need to be kept in line, whether it's quote-unquote right or wrong. You can't just cherry-pick which laws you want to follow and then disregard the others, and he makes a solid point. Deciding to switch sides, Peter tells MJ and Aunt May that they are no longer safe in Avengers Tower and need to leave, but Peter would be attacked by Iron Man, who, disturbingly, had his family under surveillance all along. Peter and Tony are at each other's throats, and Peter is angry at himself more than anything for having been so foolish. Their fight carries over from inside the tower to the city street below. To give himself the advantage, Tony uses an override to completely shut Peter's suit down. Cheater. This forces Peter to flee into the sewers, but he is tracked down by Thunderbolt's members, Jester and Jack-O-Lantern, who overpower and threaten to kill him, despite S.H.I.E.L.D. telling them to stand down. This is exactly why you don't employ supervillains like this, folks. They won't follow any of the rules. Peter is saved when Jack-O-Lantern is shot and killed by the Punisher, who Peter only sees in the form of a smoke-like skull, the result of a hallucinogenic bomb that had been thrown at him. Peter's injured body is then taken to the Resistance headquarters to be patched up. He's suffered multiple fractures and has lost a lot of blood. Just as an FYI, Punisher is against the Registration Act, but he's also not part of the Resistance. His form of vigilantism is something Captain America won't stand for. Steve beats the piss out of him at one point, calling him a coward, a murderer, and downright insane. So yeah, Frank Castle is kind of a loner in Civil War. He's not an official member of either side, but that's what the character has always been. He is a hero technically speaking, but one that should never be mentioned in the same sentence as the rest of them. His actions are still monstrous. He may be the lesser of the two evils, but he's still evil, the kind of person no one should ever be. At a few points throughout the Civil War story, Iron Man and Captain America would try to put aside their differences and end the conflict. They would meet discreetly at the ruins of the old Avengers mansion, having a heart-to-heart discussion and reminisce over other times in the past they had fought each other and reconciled. Steve isn't tricked by Tony's attempts at nostalgia, though. He moves past it. He focuses on the present. Neither man is moving an inch with their beliefs on the Registration Act. Steve thinks superheroes have every right to act when they feel the need to, and that being forced to reveal their identities would make them not only targets of their villains, but even certain government officials if they were voted in, bringing up his time as Nomad. Tony's personal guilt surfaces. He feels if it hadn't been the new warriors in Stamford leading to a new law, it could have been him years ago when he was battling with his alcoholism. All Tony wants is superheroes to have accountability like he should have had. Heroes are only human. They make mistakes. Not every one of them are as consistently effective as Captain America. Do I sense a bit of envy there? Keep in mind, Tony doesn't have any superpowers. This Registration Act affects those with powers primarily, especially those that are unable to turn them off and hide them from society. You could view the act as simply a way to even the playing field between the powered and non-powered. Anywho, Tony starts insinuating that Steve is using his symbol of Captain America, the admiration he has from so many heroes, to manipulate them to join his side. Steve angrily counters by saying Tony is manipulating his heroes with paychecks and insurance coverage. He also brings up Spider-Man and how controlling him was disgusting. Cap would deliver a bit of a tasteless low blow here though. He says what Tony wants, Tony gets. He puts himself and his beliefs above everyone else, a behavior he has seen in a lot of alcoholics. Remember, his father had been one. The two former friends are at an impasse. Personal issues are getting in the way of their arguments. Steve goes to leave, but Tony puts his hand on his shoulder. Tony removes his armor, and Steve drops his shield, and the two begin fighting. Eventually, they stop, pick up their gear, and sadly walk their separate ways. They used to have each other's back, but that day is long gone. Later in the story, Tony and Steve would meet again at Yankee Stadium late at night to have a parlay. This time, unlike at the chemical plant, Captain America's resistance would have the upper hand and be the ones to set a trap, against Cap's wishes, mind you. Iron Man would be able to overpower the combined heroes by himself, mainly when fighting Spider-Man, as Tony had, just as Pete believed, been analyzing his powers while he had been wearing his advanced suit. Tony had found a way to counter Peter's spider sense and create false positives to trick it. As much as Tony wanted to arrest them all, he decided to let the resistance go. He's a man of his word. He and Steve's meeting was supposed to be a peaceful one, and it will stay that way. The stress from the Civil War almost leads Tony back into his alcoholism. He goes to take a swig of hard liquor, but is thankfully stopped by the Invisible Woman, who slaps it out of his hand. A final battle between the pro-registration and anti-registration heroes happens at the number 42 complex in the negative zone. Captain America and his resistance go there to break their superhero friends out, but are stopped by Iron Man, Mr. Fantastic, and their combined force of heroes and nanite-controlled villains. Both sides had a mole who had infiltrated the other, which is how they knew this attack was going to take place. The Resistance mole was Hulkling, posing as Yellow Jacket, and he would use Hank Pym's voice and retinal pattern to unlock all of the cells in the prison and help even the odds for the Secret Avengers. Cloak would use his abilities to create the largest portal he has ever made to absorb everyone fighting into it and release them back in New York near the Baxter Building. Namor and his army of Atlanteans arrive to assist Captain America after some convincing by Susan Storm earlier, and Iron Man calls in the wannabe Thor again, who had his brain surgically repaired to avoid any more unnecessary casualties. Too bad this brain is smashed into a million pieces by Hercules. Good riddance to that ungodly cyborg. Captain America and Iron Man face off with each other once more. Vision would sneak up behind Tony, phase through him, and cause his armor to malfunction. Iron Man is then brutalized by Captain America's shield, and as he's pinned against a rock, Tony asks Steve to finish him off. Before he can follow through with the final strike, however, paramedics, firefighters, and police pull Captain America away. Steve looks around and realizes that all the fighting has made him lose focus on the bigger picture. All of the Avengers on both sides of the conflict have caused irreversible collateral damage. Over 40 innocent people have died, caught in the crossfire of the feuding superheroes. They're no longer fighting for the people, they're just fighting. Captain America would make the decision to surrender and order his troops to stand down. Like I had mentioned earlier, and really throughout this video, not only was the Marvel Universe at war with itself over politics, the Registration Act, but other personal issues and past quarrels between characters also stoked the fire. Ego and envy played the role of lighter fluid at times. Everyone was seeing red. Many weren't thinking clearly. This is the case with a lot of military conflicts. The longer a battle goes on, the less intelligible everything fueling it becomes. In the end, it's just a list of senseless casualties on both sides. Marvel Civil War is a fairly decent storyline. I have very fond memories of it myself. I know you'll see a lot of people bash it occasionally because its political ideas were mishandled in areas. Things got a little too scrambled at times. But like I said, war can be messy. Politics can be messy. It goes with the territory. For all its faults, I still admire Civil War for how well it injected real-life politics into the world of superheroes. I think the 2016 live-action film set in the MCU did everything much better, but the comic still has a lot to say if you stick with the main core storylines I covered here, the ones I brought up at the beginning. When it comes to registration, I think both sides are justified in their stance. It's fun talking about the rights of fictional superheroes and the importance of secret identities. I lean more on the side of Captain America because discrimination is discrimination. Everyone has the right to live the way they want to and have the right to privacy. Revealing their identities would prove dangerous to not only them but their loved ones if that information was compromised. And having the government be in control of the superheroes would mean their actions could be compromised as well. They could easily be blackmailed, turned into attack dogs, weapons of war if their leaders wanted. That said, rights are human creation. They are something written down on a piece of paper and are not set in stone. Around the world they vary, and under certain circumstances they can be altered or taken away entirely. Rights are privileges, and if you have them, I believe you need to be responsible with them. Like the comic states several times, freedom and security don't always go hand in hand. Sometimes you can only have one or the other, not both. And when it comes to someone's rights versus someone's safety, I think safety should always be given precedence. This doesn't mean a right has to be completely eliminated in every instance. That's not always the best way to go about it, but more often than not, I think they should be regulated and altered for the greater good. A strong example of this would be the recent COVID-19 pandemic. A lot of people changed the narrative and made it about themselves, their individual freedoms. But what it really was about was stepping up to the plate, being selfless and saving lives other than your own, putting trust in people a lot smarter than you are. Freedom in that instance was a necessary sacrifice. Securing the lives of everyone was far more important than pampering the select few. While I side with Captain America ideologically for the most part, if superhumans were real and a registration act was enforced by the government, like the one in Civil War, I think I would really favor Iron Man. Superhumans would be far too powerful to be given free rein to do whatever they wanted. We already have issues with gun violence, police brutality. Imagine these kinds of people having the power of nuclear weapons in the palm of their hands. What if they were under the influence of drugs or alcohol and set them off just for fun? It would be a nightmare. I'm not saying we would imprison these people in another dimension, that'd be going too far, but we would need to control them, regulate them, make them accountable. There would just be too many lives at risk, too many tax-paying dollars on the line. Following Captain America's surrender at the end of the Civil War story, general amnesty was given to all unregistered superheroes. Tony Stark would become the new director of S.H.I.E.L.D., something he had hoped for from the very beginning, feeling he was the only one capable of keeping the identities of his friends safe. He would create the 50-state initiative, which placed at least one team of superheroes in every state in America. Some heroes would still try to act outside of government jurisdiction, though. Some would flee to Canada to work the old-school approach, and the number 42 complex in the negative zone remained, but now only a prison for superpowered villains. In another controversial story called One More Day, Spider-Man's identity would be hidden from the world again after Peter was forced to make a deal with Mephisto to save his dying aunt after May had been inadvertently shot by an assassin sent to kill Peter by the Kingpin. Not only was his identity made secret again in the most contrived way possible, but the trade-off was that his marriage with Mary Jane Watson was erased from existence too, which sucked and was a slap in the face to longtime readers. However, in the lead-up, I did like the idea that Peter had become so full of rage at the possible death of his aunt, wanting to kill the person or persons responsible, that he started wearing his black suit again. Then we had Fallen Son, the death of Captain America. While being taken to the courthouse to stand trial, Steve Rogers would be assassinated by Sharon Carter on its steps, brainwashed by Dr. Faustus and Red Skull. His funeral would be attended by superheroes, civilians, reporters, and politicians on both sides of the Registration Act. Don't forget, these are comic books we're talking about, though. Captain America would not stay dead. He wasn't really dead. His consciousness was just temporarily displaced out of space and time. It happens. Like it is with any major political discussion, when battle lines are drawn and the true colors of someone's character rise to the surface in the aftermath, personal relationships can crumble and never be fully repaired. And it was the same with the Marvel superheroes. Following Civil War, nothing was ever really the same between them. I'd like to hear your thoughts on the Civil War story. Which argument was stronger? Which side would you be on based on the context of this story, and if superhumans were walking among us in real life? I want to thank you all for sticking it out and watching this lengthy comic review. I promise the next several will not be as long. If you enjoyed the video and would like to see more content like it in the future, make sure to subscribe, hit that bell icon for notifications, and become a producer over on Patreon if you can. I will see you all in the next one. Take care of yourselves, and always stay nerdy.